Take me as your concubine. You can do whatever you want, said the poor mom with her son. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let the afternoon settled over Willow on with a dry, aching stillness. The heat hadn't broken yet, and the air clung to the skin like dust that wouldn't brush off. Sunlight bled low over the cracked roofs and baked wooden porches of the small desert town. Most folks had already gone inside, drawn to whatever bit of shade or water they could find. The street was empty except for a dog asleep under the wagon outside Holcomb's store, a few horses tied up with drooping heads, and a man sitting alone on the sheriff's office steps. Sheriff Mason Dyer, aged 46, had been in Willow Run for 9 years. Before that, he'd worn a soldier's coat for the better part of a decade, fought in places he didn't care to name, and outlived men he still saw in his sleep. After the war, he came west looking for quiet. Willow Run was small, too dry to draw gold hunters, and too far off the trail for serious trouble. That suited Mason. He kept order, mostly by being the kind of man people didn't want to test. He hardly spoke unless there was cause, but when he did, folks listened. He sat on the edge of the porch now, his boots planted firm, elbows resting on his knees, chewing on a strip of tough beef jerky. A jug of warm, well water sat beside him. Across the street, the wind rattled the hanging sign above the grain store. Nothing urgent stirred, just another day crawling to its end until he saw her. At first, he didn't move. He just watched the way a man does when something unfamiliar walks into a space that stayed unchanged for too long. She came in slow from the far end of town, emerging from the shimmering horizon like she'd been walking for hours. A young woman, mid-20s maybe, thin as a rail, sunburned, her blue dress stained and torn near the hem. One of the straps was half off her shoulder, no shoes. Her feet were caked with dirt and dry blood. Clinging to her side was a boy, maybe 3 years old, no older. He wasn't crying. He looked past that, too tired, too hungry. His arms were wrapped around her neck, legs limp against her hip. She didn't carry him like a burden. She carried him like he was the only thing keeping her standing. She didn't look around as she entered town, didn't call out for help, just walked up the center of the street with the sun hitting her back and her shadow stretching ahead of her. Curtains moved. Someone inside the saloon leaned forward to get a better look through the dusty window, but no one stepped out. Mason stood slow and deliberate. His hand went near his belt, but didn't rest on his gun, just instinct. He took 2 steps forward and waited. She stopped at the foot of the steps, looking up at him with eyes that were bloodshot and unfocused. Her face was strewn with dirt, lips cracked, and sweat soaked her collar. She looked like she hadn't eaten a full meal in days. She spoke in a voice so flat and dry it sounded like it had come from someone else's mouth. "Take me as your concubine," she said. "I can do whatever you want. Used feed my boy." The words weren't theatrical. There was no pleading in her tone. No shame either, just exhaustion, a kind of raw, empty survival instinct. The boy stirred slightly in her arms, but didn't lift his head. Mason felt his jaw clench. He didn't move at first, just looked at her, really looked. Her posture, the way she was breathing, the strain in her arms. She wasn't bluffing. She meant what she said. And that hit harder than he expected. She wasn't the first desperate person to walk into Willow Run, but this was different. There was no performance in her, no manipulation. This was a woman who had nothing left to trade except herself. And even that wasn't an offer. It was a surrender. He didn't speak, just stepped aside and opened the door to his office, holding it without fanfare. She hesitated just for a second. Her body tensed like she wasn't sure if this was a trick. Then she moved past him into the cool interior. The office was plain, desk, 2 chairs, rifle on the wall, old maps rolled and tied with twine. One jail cell in the back, mostly unused. Mason went straight to the shelf where he kept dry rations. He didn't ask questions. Found a hunk of cornbread left over for breakfast, not fresh, but edible. Poured a glass of milk from the jug, still cool enough. He set them on the desk and nodded toward the bench. The woman, Lala Rowan, though he wouldn't learn her name until much later, sat slowly, legs trembling beneath her. She adjusted the boy in her lap, whispering something in his ear. The child blinked, eyes glassy, and then reached with small, shaking hands for the bread. Mason watched him eat. Watch how he devoured it, pausing only to drink in slow sips, as if afraid it might disappear. The woman didn't touch a thing. She stared at the floor, her hands wringing each other in silence. Something moved behind Mason's ribs, but he kept his face still. This wasn't the time for sympathy or questions. She didn't want comfort. She wanted safety, just enough of it to keep her child alive for another night. Once the boy finished, Mason took the blanket from the shelf and pointed toward the back room. He still hadn't said a word, didn't need to. She nodded faintly, gathered the boy, and followed the gesture. Her steps were unsure, her feet leaving faint smudges of dried blood on the wooden floor. The back room had a cot, narrow, steep, but clean. A chip bowl, a pitcher, a small bar of soap. He watched her settle the boy down, tucking the blanket around him with slow, deliberate care. Then she sat on the cot's edge, facing away from the door, her shoulders low, but not slumped. He left her there and returned to the porch. Outside, the sun had nearly dipped below the ridge. The heat was fading, leaving behind a cool breeze that stirred the dust in little circles along the street. Mason sat back down, picked up the jerky again, but didn't take a bite. Inside, a woman and child were sleeping. Maybe just resting. He didn't know if they'd stay. Didn't know what they'd been through or who might come looking for them, but he knew what fear looked like and shame. And the kind of panic that doesn't come with screams, just silence. She'd walked into town ready to give herself away because she thought that was the only way her son would survive. That didn't sit right with Mason. Not then, not ever. He didn't raise for now. No promises, no questions. He didn't need to know everything yet. But he knew she didn't belong to anyone. And no one was going to take her out of Willow Run without going through him. Even if she left tomorrow, that was her choice. But tonight, she and that boy were safe. That much he could give. The next morning broke slow and pale over Willow Run, the kind of quiet daybreak that made even the roosters hesitate. The town moved with the pace of routine, smoke rising from chimneys, porch doors creaking open, and boots scuffing along dirt paths. Mason Dyer was already up like always. He'd been awake since before first light, sitting at his desk with a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. The same untouched wanted posters spread on the table, though no one had passed through in weeks worth chasing. He didn't look toward the back room. Not yet. He could hear soft breathing behind the wall. The voice mostly small and rhythmic and once or twice a heavier exhale that sounded like a woman who hadn't slept this safe in a long while. He left them be. By the time he stepped out onto the porch, the sun had crested the ridge. He nodded once to old Mendel limping past with a sack of feed and went to check the pump near the jail fence. It squeaked like it always did. Cold water spilled into the tin bucket and he carried it back inside without spilling a drop. Lala was standing in the center of the room when he returned barefoot and straight-backed. The boy clinging to her dress behind her leg. Her braid was tighter now, freshly tied. She must have found the soap. The bruises under her eyes were clearer in daylight, not purple anymore, but greenish and fading. She didn't speak, just stood there like she didn't know what came next. Mason set the bucket down by the wall, then poured some into a smaller basin and placed it on the table along with a rag. The boy peeked out from behind her, eyes tracking Mason, but not scared anymore. Used watching. You can stay back there another night, Mason said, his voice low and even. If you want. He waited. She said nothing, just gave a small nod. No questions. No thanks. She seemed unsure if she was allowed to answer more than what was needed. You eat. Another shake of her head. Mason went to the cabinet, cut 2 more slices of cornbread, and added a handful of dried apple from a jar. He handed the plate to her. She hesitated, then took it with both hands. Set it down on the table, tore a piece for the boy first, then sat him up in the chair to eat. Only once he was chewing did she take a bite for herself. She ate slow, cautious, like part of her was still braced for someone to take it away. Mason leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. He could see more clearly now. The scarring on her arms, a long-healed gash near her collarbone, the way her eyes never settled in one place for long. She didn't wear fear like a fresh wound. She wore it like something that had sunk deep into her ribs. The kind that didn't leave when you were finally safe. Name? A asked. She didn't lift her eyes from the book. Leila, she said, then quieter. Lelo Rowan. My boy's Tommy. Mason gave a slight nod. Noted it. There wasn't much else she gave him. He didn't push. Where from? She paused, considering not whether to lie, but whether it mattered. North, past Ridge Bluff, farm country. A waited again. My husband's dead, she added, though there was no emotion in it. No explanation. We left in the night. That's all. Mason didn't ask more. There were things he didn't need to hear spelled out. A woman arriving barefoot with a child, too thin to lift her voice, offering herself for food. You didn't have to dig too deep to know what she'd run from. He poured her a tin cup of water and placed it on the table, then reached behind his desk drawer and took out something small, a carved wooden horse worn smooth from years of being handled. He set it down beside the bow. Tommy stared at it, then reached out, touched it once, and looked up at Mason. No words, but something shifted. His jaw loosened, shoulders relaxed just slightly. A child didn't fake that. By mid-morning, Lila had taken a sweeping the porch. Mason didn't ask her to. She found the broom beside the fence and moved with slow but focused strokes, keeping the boy nearby out of the sun. Mason watched her from the corner of his eye. She didn't speak to anyone, but when Mrs. Beckett passed on the way to the store, Leila gave a polite nod. That was enough to get the old widow talking half the walk down the road, not with kindness, but curiosity. The kind people in small towns like to call concern. Where is she from, Serif? Mrs. Beckett had asked later, arms folded, watching Leila from across the street. Don't look like she's got kin. Mason didn't answer. Eust went back to mending the hinge on the jail cell door. Slow and deliberate. That was his way of ending conversations. By afternoon, Lola had taken Tommy to sit beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the office here. He played with a wooden horse in the dirt while she mended the tear at her dress. Her hands moved steady, her eyes scanning the town without drawing attention. She noticed everything, the way people paused when they passed, the glances through windows. But she didn't shrink. That night, she cooked. Nothing fancy, just beans and salt pork Mason had stocked. But she made enough for 2 bowls, not 3. Mason split his with Tommy. He didn't eat with them, just sat on the porch like always, his fork clicking against the tin plate. When the sun dropped and the stars rose over the hills, Lalo returned to the back room. Tommy curled into her side on the cot. Mason heard the soft rustle of the blanket, then quiet. He stayed up a while longer, cleaning his revolver, even though it hadn't been fired in years. Something was changing. He could feel it in the way the boy laughed, short and sudden, when the kitten from Doll's shed wandered by and batted at the carved horse. In the way, still silent, had started brushing her hair tighter. In the way she looked him in the eye now, not long, but just enough. Mason didn't know what they were staying for. Maybe they didn't either, but they hadn't left. And that was something. The third morning started quieter than the last. They hadn't left. And that was something. The third morning started quieter than the last. No breeze, no footsteps outside, just the sound of a spoon clinking gently against the inside of a tin bowl and the occasional scrape of boots on wood. Leila had risen early. She was already by the pump drawing water before most of the town stirred. Tommy sat nearby on an overturned bucket, chewing a strip of dried apple, watching her with the kind of quiet that stuck to children who'd seen too much too young. Inside the sheriff's office, Mason was finishing a note for the supply wagon due in next week. He wrote slow, careful. He didn't need much beans, lamp oil, ammunition. He added 2 bars of soap and a roll of calico cloth before setting the list aside. The calico was a decision. It wasn't charity. It was just practical. She needed another dress. One that wasn't falling apart every time she walked. And he figured she wouldn't ask for it. Leila came in just as he was folding the note. Hair braid was neater today and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She didn't ask for permission, just walked to the bucket, filled a basin, and began scrubbing the floorboards near the back wall where dust had collected. She worked slow and deliberate, not performing for him, just doing what needed doing. Mason watched for a moment, then stood. Ella be out back. Check in the fence line, he said. She didn't respond, but he caught the barest flicker of a nod. Outside, the sun had barely cleared the hills, but already the ground felt warm under his boots. The fence behind the office stretched toward the creek bed. A half-rod line of posts and wire meant more to mark space than to keep anyone out. He checked the posts one by one, resetting a loose stake and tightening the wire. The quiet work steadied him. Always had. He stayed out longer than usual. Not because of her, because of himself. He'd been alone a long time, not just in the physical sense. People passed through, neighbors waved, dolls shared news. Beckett complained about weather and sin, but real closeness, the kind that shared silence and air and daily things that hadn't existed in Mason's life since before the war. Since before Caroline, he thought about her sometimes when it got quiet like this. Caroline with a red scarf and a laugh that had cracked through every hard part of him. She died while he was off fighting, typhoid, fast and cruel. By the time he came home, there was nothing to come home to. He shook the thought away and walked back toward the office. Tommy was outside now, chasing the kitten with slow, careful steps. His laughter, soft but real, echoed faintly off the walls of the jail. Mason stopped at the corner and watched for a moment. The boy moved freer than he had the day before. Still cautious, but not hollow. Inside, Leila had finished cleaning and was now brushing crumbs off the desk. The room smelled faintly of lye and sun-dried cotton. She looked up when Mason entered, but didn't flinch or pause. She just stepped back and let him pass. He poured a fresh cup of coffee and sat down behind his desk, resting his arm on the edge, eyes scanning the street through the open door. It was late morning now. The town had started to wake fully. A rider passed through with a letter pouch. Someone banged a pot near the stable. Life continued, slow and forgettable, which was exactly how Mason liked it. But something had shifted, and not just in his office. It started with the whispers. First from Mrs. Beckett, who spoke loud enough on purpose while greeting Mrs. Doll outside the store. "Sis still there, Lord above. What's she doing sleeping in the jailhouse with a child?" Then from EMT Thorne, who ran the stables, muttering as he brushed his mule, "Ain't proper. Sheriff letting a stranger stay. Folks got rules." By Mida, a few more heads turned when Mason walked through town for his usual round. One storekeeper hesitated before offering him credit for the supplies. Another, a younger ranch hand with more mouth and sense, asked half under his breath. "That woman yours now, Sheriff?" Mason didn't answer. Used stared the boy down until he looked away. Back at the office, Lalo was fixing the latch on the back gate with a bit of twine and bent nail. She didn't ask permission. She saw it was broken and fixed it. That was her way. Mason stood behind her a moment. "You can take the boy to church tomorrow if you want. He said, Miss Porter teaches some of the younger ones in the back room. Ella be safe." She paused, then looked over her shoulder. "Will they know what I was?" Mason's face didn't change. "You were hungry. That's all they need to know." She looked at him for the first time that day. Not past him, not toward the floor, at him. Her eyes didn't show gratitude. They showed something more cautious, like a person trying to believe they wouldn't be punished for relaxing. That night, they ate together for the first time. No table, just the porch steps, the boy between them, a bowl of beans each. Tommy fell asleep before finishing his and Lila carried him back to the cot. When she returned, Mason was still sitting outside, arms crossed, eyes on the sky. She stood beside him, not asking to join. He nodded once toward the empty step next to him. She sat. They didn't talk. The silence was different this time. Not loaded, not cold, just shared. For the first time, Lala didn't seem ready to leave the next day. And Mason, though he didn't know why, was glad she hadn't. Sunday arrived with the sound of a distant church bell. Low and uneven, carried by the wind across Willow Run Small Basin. The sun was already rising warm and high over the land. Dust clung to the air, still and golden as the town began to rouse under its weight. Mason was already up, seated on the porch steps with a cup of hot coffee. The town's only church, a squat wooden building with a bowed roof and a leaning cross, sat across from the old grain shed. He could see its doors swinging open, a handful of folks filtering in, dressed in their starchy best. Behind him, inside the office, he heard movement, soft, careful steps. Leila had dressed the boy in the cleanest shirt they had. She'd taken Mason's offer seriously, even though she hadn't said so. She'd scrubbed Tommy's face, combed his hair with her fingers, and knotted a bit of cloth around his neck to keep the dust off. He looked tired, but healthier. The boy was walking steadier now, laughing more often, but he still clung to her legs when he stepped into the sun. Mason looked over his shoulder as the door creaked. She stood there holding Tommy's hand. "We'll go," she said quiet, "just for a while." He gave a nod. "Miss Pork will take him for an hour or so. They give the kids bread after." Lala hesitated, then added, "If you don't want to stay, I'll bring him back." He didn't tell her it was fine either way. He didn't have to. She stepped down the stairs, shoes still worn thin, but her walk was firmer. She crossed the road with Tommy's hand in hers. The townsfolk outside the chapel glanced away. Some nodded politely. A few stared longer than they asked.